Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another session here. I hope everyone's doing well. So, we're almost towards the end of the semester, so just a few more weeks. I hope everyone just hangs on and then we'll finish up strong here. So, we'll continue with the material. We have a bit to do, so 3 more weeks worth of classes to go. So, a little bit of material that we can get through, and I think we are on pace to finish up with everything we set out to do for the semester. So I am kind of pleased with that outcome for the most part, right? Okay, so let's keep going with the material. In today's session we're going to switch gears up a bit again. So if you see what the evolution of what we've done so far is in the larger picture, um, is that we talked about how does a market function, right? Where does supply come from? Where does demand come from? How does the price get determined in the market? What happens when there's disruptions to supply or demand? Then we turned over and talked about how do we measure the efficiency of the market outcome, right? So at the end of the day, as economists, we are concerned about the welfare of people, and we talked about in welfare economics, how do we measure the level of welfare for the consumer, and how do we measure the level of welfare for the producer, the notions of consumer and producer surplus. And at the end of the last session, we briefly touched upon what Adam Smith had to say about all of this in his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he argues quite persuasively that people pursuing their self interest interact in markets, and millions of these transactions are entered into on a day to day basis, and that maximizes the level of consumer surplus and producer surplus, the overall total level of surplus that gets produced in the economy. Right? So, the challenge to this entire notion is what happens when the market doesn't function in the way that is desirable, right? So, that's what we'll try to address in this situation. In a certain sense, we talk about a crucial idea in economics, this notion of what we call an externality. So, we want to ask some key questions. What do we mean exactly when we say something is an externality? How do the presence of externalities affect market efficient outcomes, right? How do they alter the way markets work? What can we do, and whose responsibility is it to do something about addressing market externalities? In a certain sense, this is where we are introducing the role for government inside a market system, right? Inside a free market system, there is still a role for government, and one key role that governments can play is to address market externalities, right? And the question also turns towards the end when we'll talk about the Coase theorem, is that is it always necessary that we have a government to address externalities? Can people on their own accord act in such a way that you're able to mitigate some of these externalities, right? So we'll talk about all of these things in turn, but let's start with the big idea here, right, around externalities. So we started off when we talked about the principles which govern modern economics. One key principle that we hit upon was that markets are usually an effective way to organize economic activity, right? So in the absence of any kind of market failure, so if the market operates as it's designed to do, so millions of people, buyers and sellers are interacting with each other inside the market, and their interactions is determining the equilibrium price. If there is nothing which stands in the way of that process, then the market outcome is an outcome which maximizes total surplus, right? So the buyers with the highest willingness to pay are the people who end up buying the goods. The producers with the lowest cost to produce the good are the ones who end up supplying the good. And the market, the overall total level of surplus, the total welfare inside the system is maximized. Okay. So what do we mean by an externality, right? An externality is any kind of situation where there is some source of a market failure. It's one type of what we call a market failure. Right? So what do we mean by that? An externality is anything where private actions of some individuals, one or more individuals inside the economy, affect other people who are not directly participating in that activity, right? So it's the bystander. You're not directly involved in this transaction or in this activity, but the consequences of those actions are felt by you, right? So when we talk about externalities, we try to talk about them in two separate categories. One is what we call a negative externality, where the effect on the bystander is adverse or negative, and the other is a positive externality, where the impact on the bystander is actually beneficial, right? So the point of the entire market system is that you have an interaction between self-interested buyers and self-interested sellers, right? So self-interested buyers and self-interested sellers by design are pursuing their own self-interest. They're not affected by the external costs or benefits that their actions impose, right? So there's external cost to the actions they impose when there is a negative externality, because self-interested buyers and sellers are transacting inside the market mechanism, but their actions is having an adverse impact on bystanders, people who are not participating within the transaction, right? And similarly, there's benefits. If there's a positive externality, there's benefits as well. But the crucial thing to recognize is that self-interested buyers and sellers are not cognizant of the external costs and benefits of their actions, and in a certain sense, because they're ignoring relevant costs and benefits of their actions, the actions they do end up pursuing and then realizing inside the market equilibrium might not be efficient. So the market outcome itself might not be efficient. Okay. So the second key principle that we started off this entire course with is this notion that there is indeed a role for governments to improve upon market outcomes, right? So in a pure sense, government's role in a market mechanism is usually relegated to two things, two two major spheres of influence that we want to give to the government, right? One is the notion of property rights, right? So it's a little off script here, but it's important to recognize that inside a very neoclassical model of the economy, the role for government is limited to first ensuring that property rights are respected. So in a certain sense, what we're trying to do is that if interactions between buyers and sellers need to happen and there needs to be an element of trust, like the buyer needs to be entitled to the object that he's buying, the seller needs to be entitled to the object that she's selling, and there needs to be some enforcement of the property rights of buyers and sellers in the market, right? So you need maybe the police force in order to make sure that there is no threat of violence, right? So there is none of that. You might need a legal system to ensure that the property rights are well established and they can be enforced within a legal mechanism without any recourse to violence on the individual's behalf. So that's one key role that we reserve for governments, is to ensure that the property rights themselves are enforced properly. Okay. The second key role that governments have been bestowed inside this kind of paradigm is that if market failures exist, if there's some kind of an inefficiency which creeps into the way the market itself functions, then governments can step in and try to implement policies that can alleviate some of these issues, right, to make markets more efficient. All right. So to think through this, let's talk about some examples of negative externalities, just so you get a feel for what we're talking about. A classic case which is offered as a negative externality is pollution, right? So let's say there's a factory in your neighborhood. The factory is pursuing its own self-interest, so they're trying to produce. Got cut off there, so there was a small glitch. So anyway, we're back again. So we're talking about negative externalities, right? This is a case where the actions of self-interested people pursuing their own self-interest can impose some costs on bystanders, right? A classic case is, of course, air pollution. So the factory is pursuing its own self-interest, so they are doing what's best for them to maximize profits, and one way to maximize profits is to keep costs as low as possible, right? So when the factory emits pollution into the air, it's following its own self-interest because it doesn't want to incur the cost of pollution abatement. Without any other kind of incentive or directive, they're pursuing their own self-interest, and that's what the market guides them to do, right? So this is a classic case of a negative externality where self-interested private parties are following their own self-interest, but unfortunately it has a effect on bystanders who have no part in this transaction, right? Other classic examples of this is the uh, detrimental aspects of secondhand smoking, right? The smoker is pursuing their own pleasure, so they're smoking, and that's okay. But when they blow that air out into the open, other people who are walking by who have no part in this activity are getting affected negatively by this action. So this is a case of a negative externality where self-interested actions of private individuals, which is what the market incentivizes, can affect bystanders negatively. Right? So one way to look at this is that let's start with our basic setup in welfare economics. So let's think about um, uh, the market for gas, right? So on the y-axis we're measuring price, on the x-axis we're measuring quantity. We have a downward sloping demand curve. So if you think about what the demand curve is reflecting, it's reflecting the willingness to pay of each marginal buyer in that market, right? So this is the amount of private value which each of these consumers in this market is placing on a gallon of gas, right? So the demand curve in essence is reflecting just the willingness to pay or private valuations of different consumers in the market, right? On the other hand, we have the supply curve. The supply curve is upward sloping, and what the supply curve is reflecting is the marginal cost to the seller in the market, right? So if I look at the height of the supply curve, it tells me what the marginal cost for the seller at that quantity level is, right? So in that sense, we have the supply curve is reflecting private cost and the demand curve is reflecting private value. What's happening in the case of a negative externality is that there is uh, in the absence of any other externalities or any other market interventions or inefficiencies, in the classical case, the market goes into equilibrium at a price of $2.50 and a quantity of 25 gallons. Right? The market equilibrium is maximizing consumer and producer surplus. So, in that sense, the market outcome is efficient and is maximizing social welfare. What happens if there is a negative externality? So there's a market for gas, people buy gas, put it in their cars, but the emissions which come out of those gases from smog, from the greenhouse emissions, the effects on climate change, the effects on health outcomes for people who live in that neighborhood or in that area, all of that is an external cost, right? It's an external cost. It's not being borne by the person who's driving the car or buying the car or selling the gas or buying the gas. It's being borne by society at large. And suppose we can put the value of the harm that's being done at about $1 per gallon. Now we have to be a little clever here as to how we come up with the dollar figure. It's hard to quantify these things because they're more or less a subjective thing to a certain extent. But you can think of health costs associated with pollution related illness. That gives you a ballpark figure of what the kind of damage is or what the external cost is, right? So if you think about supply in general, it's only reflecting the private cost of the gasoline suppliers, but there is this external cost that activity is imposing on society at large, which is getting missed, right? So the social cost, from a social point of view, is the private cost borne by the supplier plus the additional external cost that that activity is imposing on the rest of society, right? So we have not only the private cost, but also the social cost, okay? So if I superimpose the demand curve over this, right, from a social point of view, the optimal quantity of gas that should be available is 20 gallons. It's the intersection of the social cost curve and the demand curve, right? So from a social point of view, this is optimal. 20 gallons and the price should be $3 a gallon, okay? If I leave the market to its own devices, I would end up here, right? At a quantity of 25 gallons where the price per gallon is $2.50. That's what we mean by a negative externality. If I leave the market to its own devices, only the private costs of the supplies is reflected in the market clearing price and the market clearing quantity, but we miss all of this social cost, the cost associated with the negative externality. Okay, so yeah, pollution has problems, but if you think about at any quantity of gas sold less than 20 gallons, the usual market dynamics are in work, right? If I sell only 10 gallons, right, the calculation is that the marginal benefit is $4. The marginal cost, including the externality, including from a social point of view, the social cost is $2, but the social benefit is $4. So there is value in producing one more unit of gas, right? So if a quantity is anywhere less than $20, the value of the additional gas that gets produced is higher than the social cost, which is which reflects both the private cost and the cost of the externality. So the market dynamics are to push the equilibrium quantity towards this equilibrium, right, towards 20 gallons. If you're And similarly, if you're on the other side of it, if you produce anything more than 20 gallons, like you would do with the market, if you don't take into account the externality, then this is a case where if Q is greater than 20, the social cost is reflected on the green curve. The social benefit is reflected here. The social cost exceeds the social benefit. So you're better off reducing how much gas gets produced and moving back into equilibrium, right? So the market dynamics, once you include the social cost, push it towards this new equilibrium. All right. So that's the problem, right? This is a clear demonstration of a market failure. From a social point of view, once you take into account not only supply is private cost, but also the cost that is borne by society through this activity, the optimal amount of gasoline that should be available is only 20 gallons. But if I leave the market to its own devices, the amount of gasoline that gets produced and becomes available is 25 gallons, right? So that's the issue here, right? If we let the market run rampant, it produces this overproduction of this good relative to what is socially optimal. Now, the question then becomes, how do I solve this problem inside the market structure itself? Okay. One way to solve this problem is to say, okay, the external the cost of the externality is about $1 per gallon, right? So if I impose $1 tax on sellers of gas, so I would tax sellers for $1 a gallon. Implicitly, what it means is that a supplier who was willing to supply at 50 cents now will have to make $1.50 in order to be able to supply the same quantity, right? It's the same argument that we had before. So when I impose a tax of $1 on sellers, for the seller to be willing to supply the same amount of this quantity, prices need to go up by $1.50. So an imposition of the tax of $1 on sellers implicitly is a way of saying that the supply curve moves from here to the social cost, and that dissipates the externality, right? So now once I impose the tax, seller's private cost and the social cost function, both of them are the same curve, this green curve now, and that basically takes the externality out of the equation, because now the social optimum is also the private optimum, right? So this is a, a story about where we begin to internalize the externality, right? So what is the problem with an externality? In the case of a negative externality, private costs are not reflecting the total cost, right? The total cost from a social point of view, it's not only just the private cost to suppliers, it's also the cost of the externality borne by the rest of society because of this activity. One way to mitigate this problem is to internalize the externality. What we mean by that is that we're going to alter the incentives in such a way that private individuals take into account the external effects of their actions. So when we impose a dollar tax per gallon on gas, sellers' costs basically reflect the social costs, right? So we are trying to move the supply curve from here, which reflects only private costs, to here, which reflects both the private cost plus the externality, so it reflects the social cost. Yeah. So this is what we call internalizing the externality, where you alter the incentive so that the private sellers in the market are absorbing not only their private costs, but also are taking into account the cost of the externality that their actions are imposing, right? So if the market participants end up paying social costs, then the equilibrium in the market is the same as the socially optimal equilibrium, and the problem is solved, right? So that's one way to get around the negative externality problem, right? By imposing a tax. Okay? So the other class of externalities that we tend to focus less on, generally speaking, is around positive externalities, right? Positive externalities are situations where private actions of individuals have beneficial effects on society at large, right? So if you think about a classic case of this, is around vaccination, right? You go and get yourself vaccinated against some contagious disease. Firstly, it protects you, so you get some private value from that action. But if enough people go about doing this, it not only protects you, it also protects your neighbor, because you are at a lower risk of transmission, which means that you're less susceptible to spread it to your neighbor, and so community transmission is limited. As so the private action of one individual produces an overall benefit for all the people around you, right? So all the bystanders, all the people around you have not participated in the activity, but you getting vaccinated helps lower the risk for everyone around you as well, right? So that's the classic example of a positive externality. It's an action pursued in self-interest, but it has positive spillover effects on rest of society, right? Another example is around education. So what we find is that, like people going to get a degree or some education, like you guys are right now, one thing is that there is private benefit to you, right? You're getting educated, your wage will be higher once you graduate, you'll have better opportunities, you're generally a better citizen, so on and so forth. But there are also positive effects on the rest of society. So what we find, at least in empirical studies, is as the education level goes up in communities, what we find is that there's a drop in the crime rate as well. So crime and education are negatively correlated. So in that sense, as the population gets more and more educated, we see a significant drop in the crime rate. Right? So you going to college and getting yourself educated, in a certain sense, is contributing to the overall decrease in crime rate in your community and society in general, and that's a positive externality. Okay. So with the positive externality, what we need to consider is not only the private value that the individual derives from this good or service, from getting this good or service, but also the external benefit that is given over to society from this on bystanders from this action. Right? So we need to take into account not only the private value, but also the external benefit of these actions. So let's look at this in example. So let's think about the market for flu shots. Right, this is a positive externality. So suppose the market is allowed to run without any alternation. It's a free market. So there's a demand for flu shots and there's a supply for flu shots. The interaction between demand and supply generates the equilibrium. So in equilibrium, a flu shot will cost $20 per shot, and there will be 20 shots which are available. Okay. Now, from a social point of view, there's an external benefit. Let's say every person gets a flu shot. From social point of view, it's about a $10 increase in value for the rest of society. So one way, how do I measure this? One way to think about it is that people get vaccinated. There's lower hospital visits, or fewer people going to hospitals, fewer people getting sick in your community. So all the lost productivity from sickness and ill health, all of that is mitigated from these actions, right? So suppose we put the number at $10 a shot. Okay. So if you think about what the social uh, curve would be, the social value curve would be, the demand curve here is reflecting private value, right? If I think about this individual here, the value they're putting on a flu shot is $40. Okay. Now, if I think about the external benefit that them getting a flu shot is bestowing on society, it's $10 per shot. So the external benefit here is that it's not only the private value that the individual derives from getting this good or service, it's also the additional value they add by getting this good or service. This is the positive externality. This is the external benefit that they're adding. So the social value curve here is reflecting not only the private value that people who buy this good or service receive, it is also reflecting the external benefit that that action bestows on the rest of society as well. Right? So the social value curve uh, tells us what the overall level of value from this action is from a social point of view. So from the social point of view, the socially optimum quantity of flu shots should be 25 flu shots, right? Because it's the intersection between the social value curve and the supply curve. So this is the socially optimal quantity, 25 shots. Now, if I let the market run in its own right, the provisioning is only of 20 flu shots. This is a case where the market under provisions a good that is highly valued by society. So market is only reflecting private value and private cost. So it provides only 20 flu shots, but from a social point of view, we would like 25 flu shots to be available in the market. So how do I do this? To make sure that I can do this, I need to internalize the externality. What can I do? I can give everyone who gets a flu shot a subsidy of $10, right? So the person who values the flu shot at $40 already, given a subsidy of $10, would value it now at $50. The person who was valuing at 35 will now value it at 45, because it's as if I go get a flu shot and I get a check for $10 for doing this from the government, right? So in this way, I can basically move the demand curve from here to the social value curve by internalizing the externality, by introducing a subsidy. An introduction of a subsidy is a way of raising the value of that good or service, right? All right. So that's how I would go about internalizing an externality when the externality happens to have positive effects on the rest of society, right? So if you think about the summary on the effects of externalities, so if it's a negative externality, it's a situation where the market quantity that is provided is more than what is socially optimal, right? So the market quantity is larger than socially desirable. If I have a positive externality, this is a case where the market under provision, so the market quantity is lower than what is socially optimal, right? In both cases, I can mitigate the issue by internalizing the externality. So if it's a negative externality, I impose a tax. I raise the cost in such a way it reflects the overall social cost, because a negative externality um, uh, not only does the private individual incur a cost, society as a whole incurs an external cost. So one way to mitigate or internalize the externality is to tax goods and raise the cost on them if it's negative. If it's a positive externality, what I would do, what policy should try to do is to subsidize these goods so you can raise the value of the good from its private valuation to its social value. Okay. Again, I hope that's clear. So we have very clear prescriptive um, policy ideas on how to deal with externalities, whether it's a negative externality or a positive externality. We know now how to deal with either of those cases using the market mechanism itself, using the power of the market itself, using the dynamics of the market itself, right? So the question then becomes, how do I implement these policies, right? So, okay, I know that um, I have basically two avenues. I know what policy to implement. The question becomes, what is the right way to implement the policy? Do I take the command and control approach? A command and control approach is a way of directly regulating these actions, right? You're trying to regulate the behavior directly. This is a way, this, in a sense, the government steps in, writes a piece of legislation, passes it, and passes a regulation saying that everyone should be compliant with it. Okay. The other way to achieve the same end is that you can use market-based policies, right? This market-based policies where you change the incentives inside the market structure itself so that you get the same desired result, right? By imposing corrective taxes or subsidies, or in the second case, we'll talk about tradable pollution permits in the case of pollution. Okay. So you have two different avenues, through different channels through which you can activate the policy that you want to see. Okay. So the argument for using market-based policies, right? So these are corrective taxes or subsidies in order to correct for a negative or a positive externality inside the market. So what we are trying to do with these market-based policies is to change calculus on a private decision maker level, right? So we're trying to introduce incentives or disincentives to alter behavior, but within the structure of the market itself, right? The big argument, we'll talk about the case about pollution abatement in detail, is that we are able to reduce pollution at a lower cost to society, raise revenue for government, and also enhance economic efficiency, right? So there is a lot to be said for implementing these kinds of policies about dealing with externalities using the dynamics of the market to guide those policies in a certain sense, right? So let's think about what the big advantage of using a market-based system is. Okay, so one big advantage, if you really think about it, I want to reduce pollution. Fine, great, that's an admirable goal, and I would like to do that. Now, the problem is that different firms in this economy are going to have different costs of pollution abatement. For one company, it might be very easy to do that. For a second company, it might be much more expensive to do the same kind of abatement, right? Different companies have different cost structures, and you need to take into account that pollution abatement, or abatement is just a fancy way of saying reduction, the costs are different for different firms in the economy, right? And if you really step through it one more step and think about what the efficient outcome from a social point of view is that firms which have the lowest cost for pollution abatement should do the most pollution reductions, right? Firms with the lowest abatement cost should reduce pollution the most because that's the cheapest way to get your maximum bang for buck. The cheapest firms who are able to reduce pollution most cheaply should do most of the reduction. Okay. So that's the big argument for using a market-based policy, because a pollution tax is efficient, like using the market-based solution and imposing a tax inside the market itself is efficient in the sense that firms which have the lowest abatement cost, with lower abatement costs, do the most abatement, and firms which have high abatement costs have higher willingness to pay the taxes. So imagine this situation, right? A firm there's two firms inside this market. For one firm, the cost of reducing pollution is $800 per ton of emission, let's say, and the taxes they would have to pay for reducing, if they didn't comply, right, is $500. Okay. This For the second firm, the cost of reducing pollution is $400, and the tax they would have to pay if they didn't reduce pollution is $500. In this case, the second firm for whom it's cheaper to do the pollution abatement should reduce pollution because it's in their best interest, and the second firm for whom the cost of reducing pollution is greater than the taxes they would have to pay should not do any pollution abatement and instead just pay the taxes, right? So in a certain sense, that's the argument we're trying to make, right? To incentivize firms to still take advantage of the self-interest which is built into the market mechanism, right? So if you try to regulate this from a command and control point of view, if you try to do regulation by saying all the firms should reduce pollution by the same amount, we are not able to take into account this dynamic that firms with the lower abatement costs will do more uh, should do heavier reductions in abatement. Okay. So, okay, we've talked about this. So the corrective tax, in a certain sense, gives an incentive to firms to continue to reduce pollution as long as the abatement cost is greater than the taxes, right? As long as the cost of doing abatement is less than the tax that they would have to pay otherwise, firms can continue to reduce pollution. So you might want to cut emissions by 20%, but sometimes if you implement this policy, firms might choose to voluntarily go past what is regulated to cut emissions by more than 20%, because as long as the abatement cost is lower than the taxes they would have to pay, they're incentivized to continue to cut pollution, right? Firms which are regulated in the command and control format, where I tell each firm that you have to cut your pollution to this level, have no incentive to go further beyond that, right? There's no market incentive, no other kind of incentive for me to say, okay, every firm should reduce pollution by 20%. My incentive is to reduce pollution by 20%, become compliant with the regulation, and not do much more beyond that, right? I don't have any other incentive to continue beyond that point. But in a market-based policy solution, there might be an incentive for firms to continue to uh, do pollution reductions even beyond the mandated minimum. Right? To see this in action, let's take a very simple example and see how this actually works. Okay, so here's a case. Right? So suppose there's two coal-burning power plants in the US. Right? There's Acme and US Electric. Okay, right now, they're each emitting 40 tons of sulfur dioxide, which is harmful, which is imposes health costs on people who breathe it in into the atmosphere. Okay, so the total emissions are about 80 tons a month, 40 tons from Acme and 40 tons from US Electric. Suppose the policy goal here is that okay, we want to reduce emissions by 25%. Overall total emissions, government wants to reduce it by 25%. So instead of 80 tons per month, we want to bring it down to 60 tons per month. Okay. Now, the cost of reducing emissions is not the same for both firms. Okay. To reduce a ton of sulfur dioxide in the air, for Acme, it costs them $100 per ton to reduce the emission. And for US Electric, it costs them $200 per ton of emissions. Right? So it's obviously much more expensive in this case for US Electric than it is for Acme. Okay? All right, so that's the basic setup. So let's think about the first policy option. This is the simplest option, it's the most attractive option. So government, policymakers get together, they put their heads together and they say, okay, so we want to reduce overall emissions by 25%. Here's a simple regulation. Every firm is mandated, every coal burning power plant in the country is mandated to cut their own emissions by 25%. So if every firm in the market cuts their emissions by 25%, then the overall reduction is also 25%. It's very simple, straightforward. So every firm must cut its emissions by 10 tons, right? By 25%. Okay. So think about this, right? So both firms, both Acme and US Electric, both need to cut their emissions by 10 tons. So the cost of reducing emissions is $100 per ton for Acme and $200 per ton for US Electric, right? So the cost to Acme is that they need to cut 10 tons worth of emissions. They're at 40, they need to bring it down to 30. So they have to cut emissions by 10 tons. It costs them $100 per ton. So the total cost to Acme is $1,000 to get compliant with the new policy of each firm being required to cut emissions by 25%. Okay? On the other hand, for US Electric, to cut emissions by 10 tons, it costs them $200 per ton. So now the cost to them is $2,000. So the total cost of achieving this policy goal is $3,000. Okay? All's well and good, right? You wrote a piece of legislation, the policy objective has been attained, you cut the emissions to 60 tons, each firm did its part, cut their emissions by 10 tons each. But what straight away, if you're clever, you can notice what the problem here is, right? There's not a problem as much as it seems there seems to be an inefficiency here. Both Acme and US Electric have cut emissions by the same amount, right? Acme dropped its emissions by 10 tons. US Electric also reduced their emissions by 10 tons, but it cost US Electric twice as much money to get to the same point. Okay? That's the inefficiency that people who are supportive of market-based solutions to these externality problems are pointing to. That if you do direct command and control regulation, this is the kind of inefficiency that might crop in. So what is the alternative, right? Let's consider a second policy option, right? This is an option about tradable pollution permits. So if you ever heard the phrase cap and trade, this is what we are. This is basically how that policy goal is operationalized. So what the story here is that first, the policy goal is that emissions need to be capped at 60 tons, right? Right now they're at 80 tons, too high. We want to get it down to 60 tons. So how would you go about implementing the policy inside a market system? So you would first create 60 permits. So you'd issue 60 permits. So if you hold a permit, if a firm holds a permit, it's allowed to emit 1 ton of emissions. Okay. You give 30 of these, there's only 2 firms in our example. So you take these 30 permits, 60 permits and give 30 to Acme, 30 to US Electric. Okay. Then you establish a market where these 2 firms can meet each other and trade these permits amongst each other. Okay. So each firm is allowed to use all of its permit, so it can emit up to 30 tons, no problem, because they have 30 permits, they can emit 30 tons. If a firm wants to go over that limit, it needs to buy a permit from the other firm, right? It needs to pay the other firm to buy this permit, and then it can emit beyond 30 tons. So you can purchase extra permits to emit greater than 30 tons. And if your emissions are lower than 30 tons, you can take the remainder of your permits and then trade it with somebody else, okay? With the other firm. All right. Let's think about what would happen if Acme just uses 20 permits and sells 10 of them to US Electric for $150 each. Okay, so let's think about what the situation here is. The goal here again is to just reduce emissions from 80 to 60 tons. That's the main goal, right? That's the thing we are after. Now the cost of reducing emissions is $100 for Acme and $200 for US Electric. Right? It's twice as expensive for US Electric on a per ton basis to reduce emissions than it is for Acme. Okay? So if Acme is able to sell its permits, some of its leftover permits to US Electric at $150 each, why would US Electric ever buy a permit for $150? If the price of the permit is anything less than the cost of abatement, right? So if I have to reduce emissions by a ton, it costs me $200. Instead, if I can go to Acme and buy a permit from them for $150, I don't need to I don't need to spend $200 on reducing emissions. I can just buy a contract which allows me to continue to emit one extra ton for $150, and it's a good deal, right? So what Acme does is that it sells 10 permits to US Electric for $150 each. Okay, so from this, Acme receives $1,500 from US Electric because it sold this contract and it collects the money on that contract. Acme had 30 contracts to begin with. Now it uses the remainder 20 permits to emit 20 tons of SO2. So it cuts its emissions to 20 tons and emits 20 tons using the contracts it has. It takes 10 contracts and sells it to US Electric for $150 each and receives $1,500 from them. Okay. Now, Acme was at 40 tons worth of emissions. Now, given that this is what they've done, they need to bring this down to 20 tons, right? Because they have permits only for 20 tons worth of emissions. So they need to reduce emissions from 40 to 20. So they it costs them $100 per ton to reduce the emissions. So they end up spending $2,000 to reduce this emission by 20 tons. Right? So if you think about what the net cost to Acme is, that they spend $2,000 reducing emissions, but they receive $1,500 from the sale of the permits to US Electric. So the net cost here to Acme is $500. Okay. All right. So let's turn around and see what's happening on the US Electric side. So US Electric buys 10 contracts from Acme for $1,500. Right? Now, they had 30 contracts to begin with. They bought 10 contracts from Acme. So together, they have 40 total permits, right? So they can emit 40 tons, and that's what they do. They use these 10 that they purchase from Acme, plus the 30 permits that they purchased from, that they already had. And together, they emit 40 tons, and they spend nothing on abatement. So they don't do any pollution abatement. And the net cost to US Electric is $1,500 because they bought these 10 contracts. Makes sense for them to do that because they have only 30 contracts, they're emitting 40 tons. If they try to reduce emissions from 40 to 30 on their own, it would cost them $2,000 because it costs them $200 per ton. It would cost them $200 if they had to do it. Instead, they buy the contracts from Acme and they end up spending less. They end up spending only $1,500. So the total cost of achieving the same goal using this kind of a policy prescription is the $500 to Acme, $1,500 to US Electric. Together, it costs only $2,000. Right? In the previous case, when we're using a command and control type regulation, it from a social point of view, it costs us $3,000 to get to the same goal. And if you use a market-based solution like this, it costs us only $2,000 to get to the same goal. Right? So using tradable permits, we are achieving the same goal. We are achieving the same reduction in pollution that we are after at a lower cost, not only at a lower total cost, but at a lower cost to each firm, right, than using direct regulation. So that's the big advantage of using a market-based regulatory mechanism in order to achieve these goals, right? Address externalities. Right? So if you think about what this tradable pollution permit system does, it allows us to reduce pollution at a lower cost than regulation, right? Who's doing most of the pollution abatement? In our example, it was Acme. Acme's cost of doing pollution abatement was only $100 per ton, so they cut back the emissions the most, right? So to go from 80 to 60 tons, Acme goes from 40 to 20. They take on all of that, right? Because they are cheaper at doing pollution abatement. But then they turn around, the firms with high cost of reducing pollution buy these permits in order to continue to emit at the same level, right? So pollution reduction in a certain sense is concentrated among those firms which have the lowest costs, right? And from a social point of view, it's completely efficient. We are getting to the same policy goal. We still manage to reduce emissions, total emissions from 80 tons to 60 tons. What does it matter? And from a social point of view, we got to the same goal, but now it's being done in a more efficient manner, right? The firm which has the lower costs for pollution abatement is the one which is doing most of the pollution abatement. The one with the higher cost doesn't have to incur all this additional expenditure. So instead of it costing $3,000 to get to the same goal in the case with the direct regulation, with the market-based solution that we described, we can get to the same point with $2,000. Okay. And I've been asked this question before about, oh, this sounds reasonable. Do these markets exist? And they do, right? So at least in the US, there's been since 2000 since 1995, there's been a marketplace where firms can trade sulfur dioxide pollution permits, right? It's the system that I've described here, and I think since '99 or something, at least in the Northeast, I don't know if it's true in the rest of the country, in the Northeast corridor in the US, you're allowed to trade nitrogen oxide permits. It's the same system. In 2005, the European Union introduced a similar system, this cap and trade system, to regulate carbon emissions in the euro area, in the eurozone, right? So the point of this entire exercise is a very simple exercise, is to show you that even though direct regulation is attractive in the sense that it's very simple, you tell every firm to reduce pollution by the same amount, reasonable, but it might be more prudent, might be more efficient, it might be cheaper to try to implement a market-based alternative to get to the same policy. Okay. Well, we've already seen this. So what are some objections to this? Right. So one objection to this is on a more or less a moral point. Right? Senator Edmund Muskie once remarked that this cap and trade system, with this tradable permit system, what you end up achieving is that you're giving the option to anyone to pollute as long as they're willing to pay a fee in the market. Okay, and you might think that's a reasonable criticism, that like firms who have uh, lower abatement costs are doing most of the abatement, and firms with high pollution abatement costs just buy these permits. But the point is that that might be true. It might be more morally, uh, might feel more as a morally superior point of view to ask every firm to carry the same share of the burden, but it might be economically inefficient in order to do so, right? So in a certain sense, what we come down to in economics over and over again is the trade-offs, that people end up facing trade-offs, right? Emitting all pollution is virtually impossible, right? Clean air and clean water, right? There's landmark Clean Air and Clean Water Acts which were passed in the 60s and 70s. They are not a cost-free thing. Environmental regulation, though we all might agree is a good thing, comes with its own trade-off, right? There is an opportunity cost associated with it, which might lower standards of living. You want to impose stricter standards on, how much pollution there can be. It comes at the cost, by it the problem is that it'll raise the cost for producers, and in a sense it'll lower production levels in the economy and lower standard of living. So it's not as simple as us all agreeing that pollution is a bad thing and there should be less of it. That's reasonable. Most right thinking people will come to that point of view. The point is that how much pollution reduction can we do, right? How much can we do? And that's the trade off between how much pollution reduction can happen relative to the lower cost system. Okay? And this issue is much more stark in the conversations around the climate change debate, right? So the most, the criticism that comes up the most often, right, stems from this understanding that clean environment is a normal good. Okay, what does it mean? So when we talked about types of goods earlier on in this class, we talked about situations where goods can be separated into normal goods and inferior goods. A normal good is a good which becomes more attractive or as your income level rises, right? So, in a certain sense, the argument is that richer countries, because they already have higher incomes, because their clean environment has a positive income elasticity, they can afford a cleaner environment, right? They can afford to have more rigorous environmental protection. So when countries come together to discuss the problems around climate change and who should cut emissions by how much, the argument is that, okay, so for richer countries should take on a greater burden of pollution emission reduction, because in general it's much cheaper for them to do that, because of this positive income elasticity between clean environment and high GDP levels. And poorer countries which are still developing, it costs them a lot more to do the same kind of pollution abatement, right? So it costs the US much less to cut its emissions by 25% than it would cost maybe Botswana or Nigeria or India or Bangladesh to cut its emissions by 25%, right? So there is that balance that needs to be struck, right? The second kind of thing is that if we are able to reduce the price of environmental protection, if we are able to introduce new incentives which reduces the price of environmental protection, the law of demand itself is a powerful driver there, right? If something gets cheaper, more and more of that good is demanded. So if environmental protection, if we are able to come up with more efficient ways of protecting the environment, taking people against these externalities, then we might have more and more of these things, right? All right. The last thing I want to do in this section around externalities is to talk about this question of whether do we always need some kind of external actor like the government to come in uh, and work out whatever externality there is by imposing some kind of, by altering the incentives inside that market structure, right? So can private solutions be found to the problem of externalities, right? So for instance, like, one common way is that there's moral codes and sanctions, right? You don't take your garbage and dump it out in your neighbor's yard, uh, because there's moral sanctions. You live in a society and you don't want to do that because the moral codes and social sanctions can play into that, right? Charities can get involved in order to mitigate some of the ill effects of externalities. Then you can also rely more than this, going back to the notion of Adam Smith, that we are not relying on the uh, charity of the butcher uh, or anyone else. Appealing to the self-interest of individuals is a more powerful motivator, right? So there is a famous result here that Robert Coase proposed, which is known as the Coase theorem. What the Coase theorem says is that if there are no bargaining costs, if there's no absent any transaction or bargaining costs, private solutions can be found for some externalities, right? So you don't need a government as long as there is if the cost to bargaining is fairly low, you can solve the problem of externalities, and it doesn't matter what the initial distribution of rights are. Who has the right to do what is a legal obligation that people have has nothing to do with it. You just rely on people's self-interest. You allow interested parties to bargain in an environment where the costs to bargaining are low, and you can make everyone better off, and the outcome that is arrived at can be efficient. Okay. All right. To see this in action, suppose you have a neighbor. So Dick has the legal right to keep a barking dog, right? So his lease allows him to keep a dog, and the dog is barking constantly. Okay. Dick says the benefit that Dick receives from having this dog, let's say you can quantify the love and affection of an animal in dollar terms. Maybe that's it in itself arguable, but let's say the private value to Dick from having this dog is $500. Jane, his neighbor, is fed up with this barking, this constant barking of the dog, and the cost that she thinks it imposes on her is about $800. Okay, so what is the efficient outcome? Okay. Dick has a legal right, so in a certain sense, there is no recourse. Jane can't do much about it. Dick can keep the barking dog all he wants, right? So Dick has a dog. He is getting the benefit from having this dog, but he's imposing a cost on his neighbor. And Dick also has a legal right to keep the dog, so there's nothing Jane can do in that sense. But what the Coase theorem tells us is that in this case, a private solution can be found in order to mitigate the externality. What is the private solution? So Dick gets $500 of value from the dog. Jane is bearing a cost of $800. So Jane will walk up to Dick, offer him $600. Dick should happily accept. He's only getting $500 worth of value from this dog. Jane has just offered him $600. So Dick accepts the $600 to get rid of the dog. Jane was bearing a cost of $800. Now she got rid of the problem for $600. So Jane is happy. Both of them are happy. The dog goes away, and both are better off. Okay. So this is a case where even though Dick has the legal right to keep the dog, so interested parties, and he's imposing this externality on his neighbor, interested parties can just get together, bargain with each other, and still find a way to mitigate the externality, right? So consider a second case. Dick still has a legal right to keep the dog, right? And gets a benefit of $1,000, and Jane is bearing a cost of $800 from the bargain. So what would happen in this case? Dick won't accept anything less than $1,000 to get rid of the dog. Jane can't offer anything more than $800 to get rid of the dog. So the outcome is that Dick gets to keep the dog, right? This is a case where the externality is not mitigated. So the caveat here under the Coase theorem is not only the fact that the bargaining costs need to be low, it also needs to be the case that the self-interested parties value this good in question, this troublesome dog in question, in a way where the person who has the dog values it less than the cost that is being imposed on the persons bearing the cost. Then, under the conditions of the Coase theorem, we can expect that a private solution can be reached which mitigates the externality problem. Okay. So suppose instead of Dick having the legal right to keep the dog, suppose Jane can legally compel Dick to get rid of the dog. Right? She has the legal rights to for her to ask him to get rid of the dog. Okay. Dick gets a $800 benefit from having the dog. Jane is bearing a cost of $500 from the dog's bargain. Okay. So what is the efficient outcome here? The efficient outcome is that Dick is getting more value than the cost that he's imposing on Jane. So Dick can walk up to Jane, offer her $600. So Jane will happily accept it because for her the cost from the barking was $500. Now she's getting paid $600 to ignore the barking. Dick is happy because Dick gets a value of $800. He's paid $600 to Jane. He's still getting a positive value from having the dog. So Dick keeps Spot, the dog, and Jane gets $600 to put up with the barking. Okay. So again, interested parties can get together and mitigate the externality problem. Okay. So the private market, in a certain sense, is able to achieve the sufficient outcome regardless of who has a right to what. The initial distribution of the rights between the individuals doesn't really matter. Okay? So private solutions can work, right? You can try to use private solutions to get to alleviate this externality problem. But the fundamental assumption around this is that the transaction cost or bargaining cost of doing this kind of interaction is low, right? So if the transaction costs get very high, suppose you need to get a lawyer involved, so to mediate the process, or pay somebody else to be a mediator, and all of that. As the transaction costs increase, it becomes more and more difficult for a private agreement to be reached, right? Coordination problems also go along with this kind of high transaction cost problem. Like if you think about a situation like pollution, there's a large number of people who are bearing the cost of this externality, and the action is done by one private individual, right? So one factory is doing all the pollution. A large number of people are bearing the cost of the pollution. Now, how do I get everyone together and have them agree on some kind of private settlement between the factory which is doing the pollution and these individuals? So you run into massive coordination problems, and then private solutions in that sense might not work. Okay. All right. So that's basically all I want to do with externality. So, there's a couple of slides quickly summarizing everything we talked about. As usual, if there's any questions on any of the material, feel free to leave it in the comments below, or email me or see me in office hours. So I'll stop there for today's session, and then we'll come back um, next week and continue with this line of thinking. All right. All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Hope everyone's staying safe and well, and I'll see you in the next one. All right.